Hi, welcome back to the Paradigm Quilt Sew Along. I am your host, Emily from Homemade Emily Jane, and today we kick off week 5 of the Paradigm Sew Along. This is the final week for our sew along, and you can find all of the videos linked in this playlist right here. If you are just finding this video, make sure you go back to the beginning so you can follow along at your own pace. This week we are going to finish piecing our Paradigm quilt tops. During week 1 of the sew along, we picked out our fabric and we got the Paradigm Quilt Pattern from my shop, homemadeemilyjane.com. And then during week 2, we cut out all of our pieces and we made our 4 corner units. During week 3, we made our center economy quilt block. And then last week for week 4, we made our Flying Geese units. So now that all of our blocks are pieced, it's just time to piece them together and add our borders. Before we dive in to sewing this week, I want to give a special shout out to our grand prize sponsor. Our grand prize for the sew along is an AccuQuilt Go fabric cutting machine. I've been using my AccuQuilt for years and I truly love it, and I am so excited to get to give one away to one lucky participant. A handful of my quilt patterns do include AccuQuilt instructions. Paradigm is not one of them, however the Sprightly pattern is, and it's the same basic block, just using AccuQuilt dies and multiple blocks to make the quilt. So make sure you check out the Sprightly quilt pattern if you love this design and want to use AccuQuilt. I'll be picking this week's winner and announcing that winner on our email list. So if you want to be entered to win, make sure that you post your Paradigm Quilt Top progress over on Instagram and use hashtag ParadigmSAL. That stands for Paradigm Sew Along. I'll pick a random winner from everyone that participates this week and announce it in next week's email. Now, before we get started on piecing together our quilt tops, if you are making the throw size, then the first thing that we're going to want to do is piece together our border fabrics. So for the throw size, you should have a handful of with the fabric strips. And what we're going to do first is sew these together, right sides together, into one super long strip and then trim down to the sizes listed in the pattern. If you are making the baby or the pillow size, you won't need to piece your borders together, but you can go ahead and trim them down if you choose to. Or what many people do is they choose not to trim them down and they'll just trim off the excess as they're going along. That's actually my preferred method. However, it does tend to create some waviness in the borders of your quilt if you're not super careful. So I do recommend trimming to the correct size and then stitching it on for that reason. However, if you're an experienced quilter, then you probably feel comfortable not trimming first. And either way is fine with me as long as you're happy with your end result. So first things first, we're going to make our borders. I'll start off by lining these up right sides together, which is a little tricky to tell when you're using solids. So if you are using solids, make sure you're paying super close attention to the right side. And I'm gonna go ahead and stitch a 1/4 inch away from these little dots. You have the option to trim off your selvage first and then you'll have a super clear 1/4 inch. I personally like to stitch first and then trim off the selvages, so it's entirely up to you, whatever you prefer. So once you sew 2 of your borders together, just go ahead and grab one of them, put it right side up, and then grab another border strip, put it right side down, and we'll sew these together. And then we'll just repeat that process for all of our border strips. Once you get to the end, we will snip them apart, trim off our selvages so we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then press these seams either open or to the side, whichever you prefer. Now you can either trim to the size listed for each of the border lengths, or you can just kind of wrap these up and set them aside for later we'll use our borders after we piece together our blocks. So the next step we're gonna actually do in a couple different stages. So if you'll look at your design, you should have basically one row across the top, one row for the middle, and then one row for the bottom, and that's just an upside down version of the one on top. So go ahead and lay them out. If you have a design wall like me, that's great, but you don't need one. You could use a large space on the floor, the top of your bed, whatever works, so that you can kind of visualize the entire quilt as a whole, and then we'll go ahead and start sewing them together. You can refer to the diagrams listed in the pattern, or you can just kind of follow along with me. I'm gonna go ahead and start by pinning my pieces together. I'm gonna grab one of my corner units and one of my Flying Geese units and put those right sides together. Notice that the block for color 1 is going to be on the same side or row as your color 3 Flying Geese. That's how you can make sure that they don't get turned upside down. And then I'm going to start by pinning them. I'm going to start at the center seam and work my way towards the sides. So I've grabbed my nice sharp pins and I'm going to start pinning right here. And you'll notice that we can make those seams line up, check them out, and then go ahead and put a pin there. And then I'm gonna pin on this side where the Flying Geese seam comes in, and then one more on this side to make it straight. And then I'm gonna repeat that for the top row as well. Now I've pinned the top and the bottom row. I've pinned 2 pieces together. So I do still have a corner unit for the top and the bottom still that have not been pinned into place yet. I'm gonna sew the seams that I just pinned first, press them, and then I'll add that final side. So before we go over to the sewing machine though, I'm going to pin the center economy block to another Flying Geese unit. Again, right sides together. I'll just grab those off my design wall, and then this is another really big piece here, but we're gonna start at the center and line up this center seam of our Flying Geese unit with the center point of our center economy block unit. So that point should come together nicely with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm gonna pin that in place. And then I'll move over to the corners and then pin across the center as well. Now that I have 3 pieces pinned, I'm going to go stitch them all using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once your 3 seams are sewn, it's time to press them open. I do recommend pressing open here. However, if you really want to nest your seams by pressing to the opposite sides, that's an option. However, I'm going to personally press open. It just provides some extra flat seams. So just like we've done throughout the sew along, I'm going to finger press first and then use my nice hot iron. I will also grab my best press here and do a little spritz right at the points where there's any bulk or seams that intersect. Once you've done one seam, you can go ahead and pin on your next piece. So I can see here that this is going to be my bottom strip. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that other corner unit and get it pinned on next. Next, we'll just repeat that process for the other 2 pieces. You should have one more of the top or bottom strips, and then of course your big center strip. So I'm going to go ahead and set this aside and then keep pinning and pressing. Now I've got 3 more seams to sew over at my sewing machine. So now you've got 3 more seams to press just on the opposite side. So we're repeating that same process of pressing our seams open. So once you have your top and your bottom piece and your big centerpiece, we just have to sew those 3 pieces together and then add our borders. So I'm going to start by grabbing either the top or the bottom piece and pinning it onto the centerpiece. Just like all of the other ones that we've done, we are going to start at the middle and pin towards the sides. So I'm going to match up the middle of my Flying Geese seam with the center of my economy block. Next, I'm going to match up the seam on this side that is between the corner unit and the Flying Geese unit. And then finally I'll come over to the very edge and pin there as well. And then come in back through the center and pin the rest. And then once you've done one side, you can go ahead and shift over and do the other, matching up your seams where you have them, and then pinning in the spaces that don't have seams. You could go ahead and sew this seam down and then add on the second side, or you can just keep it pinned and rotate the piece and pin on your other either top or bottom. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab the other side and pin this in place as well. So now I have 2 very, very long seams to go stitch and then press. When I'm stitching really long seams like this, I like to take the pins out as I go, but it's up to you. If you're pinning the same way I am, then you could leave them in until the end as well. If you're stitching both sides, go ahead and just stitch on a leader or ender, and then trim your piece loose, and then rotate to where you have the other set of pins. It might be a little trickier to get it back lined up again, so just be patient with it. These seams are massive. So now we have pretty much our entire Paradigm quilt is pieced. So I'm gonna finish this up just by pressing these last 2 seams open. So now that my entire quilt top is pieced, the only thing left to do is add on my very long borders. Because it's a square, it doesn't matter which sides you do first. So I'm just gonna grab my border length and grab my quilt top and start pinning the border to the quilt top. So I'm actually gonna start out with the quilt top right side up and then take the border piece that I have and I'm gonna put that right side down. And you can check for where the seams are. So you want your border seams facing you, right side down towards the right side of the quilt top. And I'm gonna go ahead and start lining up. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't trim before this step to the exact size, but I recommend doing it, especially if you're new to quilting. So I've got my border piece and I'm just gonna line it up with the top of my quilt top edge and grab my pins, and I'm just gonna start pinning it in place. I'm gonna pin probably every like 5 or 6 inches, making sure that it is super flat. And then I'm also gonna be sure to pin anywhere that there's a seam in the quilt top. So we have this seam where the corner block ends, and I'm gonna pin on that seam to make sure that I stop and make sure that that seam doesn't get tucked under at the sewing machine. If you are doing it like me, which is not exactly the way that the quilt police might tell you to do, this is where I trim off my excess border fabric to line up with the edge of my quilt. And I do give it a little bit of wiggle room. It doesn't have to be anything precise, but I just have a little bit of excess there in case I need it. And then I'm gonna flip around the quilt and do the opposite side border as well. This time I'm going to start from the opposite end of my border fabric, just because I can tell with my specific fabric that it's going to end at a seam because of where the folds are. So I'm going to start at the opposite end. The quilt is right side up, the border fabric is right side down, and I'm just going to go ahead and start pinning it in place. Once you get to the end of sewing on your borders, we can press the seams to the side. Now, when it comes to pressing our borders, we are going to press them differently than any other seam so far. So make sure that you pay attention to this part. The first thing that I'm going to recommend doing is put the quilt so that it's quilt top facing you, and then the border is just above it. And I'm going to go ahead and set the seam first. And then we will press that border out, and we're going to press towards the border. So I like to start with a gentle finger press and then bring the iron. You want to be careful not to be too extreme. If you really push hard, it's going to make your border real wavy. So just try to be gentle with it and keep that seam nice and straight. Once you've done one section, we'll grab our quilt and we'll shift it over so that the other section is also on our ironing board, and we'll repeat that process. And then we'll go ahead and flip the quilt around and do that same press for the opposite border. Now, if you did your borders like I did, you will have a little excess to trim off. So next I'm going to bring this over to my cutting mat and use a ruler and my rotary cutter to get this edge nice and straight before we add our other two borders. So now you can just use any old ruler and your rotary cutter to get that edge trimmed, and then repeat that on all sides. Now I grab the rest of my border fabric and I add the last two borders the same way that I added the previous two. There's one more tip I want to share with you as you are sewing on your borders. This is one of the few times in quilting that you want to backstitch or lock in your stitch. So as I get started sewing, I will stitch 3 times in place before I start sewing down the seam. Those stitches in place keep it from unraveling between the time that we finish our quilt top and when we actually get it quilted. When we get to the end of the border seam, we're going to repeat that same process and lock that seam in place. And once you've finished pressing all 4 borders of your quilt, you are done with your Paradigm quilt top. It might look something like this. So once you're done piecing your quilt top, make sure that you get a photo of your pieced quilt top and share that over on Instagram to be entered to win this week's prize. Now this is technically where the sew along ends, but since I'm not going to be producing a video for next week when we do the wrap up, I do want to share with you where to go from here, especially for first time quilters out there. So now that you have your quilt top, the next steps are to baste and quilt your quilt and then also bind it. And I actually have a really comprehensive video walking through every step of making a quilt. So check that out right here. That'll walk you through every step of making a quilt, not just the end stages, but you can go ahead and fast forward if you like. As far as quilting goes, you have 2 options. Either you quilt it yourself or you send it off to a long arm quilter. Long arm quilters are people that have these gigantic machines that can do the quilting for you. Or if you choose to quilt it yourself, you can either do it by hand or with your sewing machine. And I have tips and tutorials for both of those methods up on my YouTube channel and on my blog. So I will be sure to include those in the email that I send out weekly and in the description below. If you have any questions about how to finish your quilt, make sure that you reach out to me or drop a comment here and I'll be happy to help. One question that I get all the time is, how do you choose what batting to use? Batting is that middle layer between your quilt top and the backing, and I have a few favorites. But if you want to really take a deep dive and learn about different types of batting, check out this video right here. This tutorial will walk you through a lot of different types of batting, and you will learn way more than you ever thought was possible about batting. Once you've picked out your batting and gotten your quilt quilted, either from a long armer or quilted it yourself, the final step is to bind the quilt, and you actually have a couple different options with how to bind it too. I have a tutorial to teach you right here exactly how to bind your quilt using your sewing machine. That's a super fast and sturdy method that you can use, and I really prefer sewing machine binding because it's so quick. Alternatively, there's another tutorial right here for hand binding your quilt. So that tutorial will walk you through how to sew your binding on with your machine and then to finish it off by hand stitching, 2 different methods. So definitely check that out if you want to learn how to bind your quilt. Thank you so much for joining me throughout the sew along as we made our Paradigm quilts together. I cannot wait to see your photos over on Instagram as you share your progress for the week, and then also feel free to keep tagging me as you do finish your quilts as well. I would love to see them. If you have any questions that maybe I didn't answer, be sure to drop them below and I'd be happy to help. And now the hardest decision is which project you want to start next. I have a variety of quilt patterns in my shop of all different levels, so be sure to check it out at homemadeemilyjane.com, and also check out my blog there as well for lots more quilting tips, tricks, and inspiration. Happy sewing!